She was 18 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. With no family left to claim her and no inheritance to speak of, she had just a small trunk, a change of clothes, and the £3 her uncle had pressed into her hand as a final, dismissive settlement. And with that pittance, she bought a ruined country estate in the damp heart of Devon. Blackwood Manor was a place of ill repute, a pile of stones nobody wanted. But what nobody knew, least of all the grasping squire next door, was that buried deep within its forgotten walled garden was something that would change not only her life, but the very shape of the parish itself. Settle in close, and let us tell you the story of Jane Ashworth. Jane's life had not always been so precarious. She was born in 1832, the only child of Arthur and Mary Ashworth, in a modest but comfortable gentleman's house in Somerset. Her father was a quiet man, a scholar of botany and a collector of books, whose hands were more accustomed to the delicate pages of a folio than the reins of a horse. He smelled of paper and dried lavender, and the kindest thing he ever did was to carve for her a small, perfect wren from a piece of fallen applewood, its head cocked as if listening. It was an object so light it felt like a captured breath, and Jane kept it always. Her mother, Mary, was the practical heart of the home, but she was taken by a fever when Jane was only 6, leaving a void that was never truly filled. From then on, Jane's upbringing was overseen by the housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a woman of formidable competence and few words. She saw in the quiet, observant child a spirit that deserved shaping, not pitying. While Arthur Ashworth taught his daughter the Latin names of flowers and how to press them in heavy books, Mrs. Gable taught her the household arts with the precision of a master craftsman. Jane learned to sew a seam so straight it looked like a pen stroke, to turn a heel on a stocking, to budget the weekly accounts down to the last farthing, and to know by scent alone when the bread was proved and the jams were set. She learned the quiet, relentless work that keeps a house breathing. Her mentor never praised her with effusive words, but with a simple, approving nod or the entrusting of a more complex task, which to Jane felt like the highest commendation. This education in practicality, in the steady, unglamorous work of making and mending, became the bedrock of her character. She was not taught to be charming. She was taught to be useful. When Jane was 14, her father caught a chill while sketching ferns in a November rain, and it settled deep in his lungs. He faded as quietly as he had lived, and with his passing, the house fell silent. Jane's guardianship passed to her mother's brother, a man named Richard Morrison, who had a fine house in London and expensive tastes. He arrived for the funeral, assessed the value of the estate, and promptly sold it, assuring Jane that the proceeds would be invested wisely for her dowry when she came of age. She was moved into a small, plain room in his London house, a place that smelled of cigar smoke and polish, where she felt more like a poor relation than a ward. Her uncle was rarely present, and his wife treated her with a cool, dismissive politeness. The 4 years she spent there were a lesson in invisibility. She continued her mending, read her father's few remaining books, and held the small wooden wren in her palm when the loneliness became a physical weight. On the morning of her 18th birthday, she was summoned not to a celebration, but to her uncle's study. He did not rise from his desk. He informed her in a tone of mild irritation that due to a series of unfortunate investments, her inheritance was gone. All of it. He was, he said, absolving himself of any further responsibility. He pushed a small, worn leather purse across the polished mahogany. Inside were 3 golden sovereigns. "This is all that remains," he said, his gaze already drifting to the papers at his elbow. "I trust you will be prudent." The cruelty was not in the loss of the money, but in the flat, administrative finality of the act. It was a dismissal, as if she were a servant whose services were no longer required. Jane did not cry, she did not argue or plead. The years with Mrs. Gable had taught her the futility of appealing to a heart that was not there. She simply inclined her head, took the purse, and went to her room. She packed her small trunk with her few clothes, her mother's silver thimble and sewing kit, and her father's little wooden bird. An hour later, she walked out of the London house and did not look back. She stood on the pavement, the noise of the city a confusing roar around her, with £3 to her name, and the whole of England before her. The first sovereign was spent on a ticket for the public coach heading west, towards Devon. Jane had chosen the destination for no reason other than a vague memory of her father, speaking of the wild beauty of the moors, a place so different from the manicured fields of Somerset. The journey was a long, rattling ordeal that lasted 2 days. She sat wedged between a stout farmer's wife who smelled of cheese and a silent, grim-faced man in clerical black. The coach swayed and jolted over rutted roads, the landscape slowly transforming outside the grimy window. The neat hedgerows and gentle hills of the home counties gave way to steeper inclines, deeper valleys, and vast, empty stretches of land under a low, gray sky. She watched the world pass with a steady, observant gaze, noting the different stone of the cottages, the way the wind bent the trees, the flocks of sheep that seemed to flow like water over the green and brown tapestry of the land. Fatigue settled into her bones, a deep, weary ache that was more than just physical. With every mile, her old life receded further, becoming a distant sunlit memory. She clutched the small purse inside her cloak, the 2 remaining sovereigns, a cold, heavy weight against her ribs. She ate the bread and apple she had bought before leaving London, rationing them carefully, and slept fitfully on the coach, her head resting against the vibrating pane of glass. She alighted in the small market town of Tavistock, the end of the line. From there, she paid a man with a pony and cart a few pence to take her further into the countryside. Towards a village she had heard the driver mention, Oakshott. The air here was different, thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint, salty tang of a sea that was still miles away. The lanes were narrow, hemmed in by ancient stone walls covered in moss and ferns. Oakshott itself was a small cluster of granite and slate cottages, huddled around a Norman church and a single public house, the Royal Oak. Jane took a room at the inn, a small, clean space under the eaves with a sloping ceiling and a view of the churchyard. The cost of the room and a simple supper of stew and bread made another serious dent in her dwindling funds. That evening, sitting quietly in a corner of the common room, she listened to the low murmur of local voices. The talk was of sheep, of the coming winter, and of the final auction of the Blackwood property. The name was spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt. "A ruin," said one man, a blacksmith by the look of his hands. "Not fit for pigs. Cursed, more like," another added. "No one's lived there proper in 50 years. The Thorns have been waiting for it to fall into their hands forever." Squire Thorn, she gathered, was the local magistrate and the largest landowner, his estate bordering the derelict manor. The conversation planted a seed. A place no one wanted would be a place that was cheap. The next morning, fueled by a desperate sort of courage, Jane walked to the solicitor's office where the auction was to be held. It felt like the last, most improbable gamble she could make. She had nothing to lose because she had almost nothing left. The auction took place in a dusty, book-lined office that smelled of sealing wax and decaying paper. There were fewer than a dozen people present, the solicitor, his clerk, a few local farmers who looked more curious than serious, and a large, imposing man with a florid face and an air of absolute authority whom Jane instantly knew was Squire Thorn. He stood with his back to the small coal fire, radiating impatience. Jane found a seat on a bench near the door, her gray woolen cloak pulled tightly around her, hoping to remain unnoticed. The solicitor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, read the description of the property in a dry monotone. Lot 1. The freehold estate known as Blackwood Manor, comprising a derelict dwelling house, sundry outbuildings in a state of collapse, and approximately 100 acres of overgrown pasture and woodland, sold as seen, with all faults. He looked up over his spectacles. "We will open the bidding at £5. A heavy silence filled the room. The farmers shuffled their feet. Squire Thorne gave a small, smug smile, clearly expecting to claim it for a pittance after the auction officially failed. The solicitor waited. "Do I have a bid of £5? The silence stretched. "Very well. Shall we say £3? Still nothing." Thorne's smile widened. He was enjoying this, the final humiliation of a neighboring estate he had long coveted. It was in that moment, seeing his unconcealed avarice, that something shifted in Jane. It was a spark of defiance she did not know she possessed. "I will bid £3, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silent room it sounded as clear as a bell. Every head turned towards her. The solicitor blinked, startled. "I'm sorry, miss?" "I bid £3, Jane repeated, her gaze steady. Squire Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound disbelief, which quickly curdled into irritation. He stared at this small, plainly dressed young woman as if she were an insect. The solicitor, recovering himself, looked at Thorne. "I have a bid of £3. Do I have 4? Thorne gave a short, contemptuous snort. He would not be drawn into a bidding war with a child, a nobody. It was beneath his dignity. He clearly assumed she was a fool who had no idea what she was buying. Let her have the ruin. It would fall down around her ears soon enough. £3 going once, the solicitor called, his voice gaining a little more confidence. Going twice. He looked around the room one last time. Sold, he said, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. To the young lady for £3. A low murmur went through the room. Jane felt a wave of dizziness, but she stood and walked to the desk. She opened her worn purse and carefully counted out her last 3 gold sovereigns onto the dark wood. The clerk hastily drew up the deed of sale. As she signed her name, Jane Ashworth, she could feel Squire Thorne's furious gaze on her back. 10 minutes later, she walked out of the office, holding a single sheet of paper that declared her the owner of 100 acres and a pile of stones. She followed the clerk's directions, walking a mile up a muddy lane that led away from the village. The lane ended at a pair of magnificent wrought iron gates, though one had fallen from its hinges and was being slowly consumed by ivy. Beyond them, a long, curving drive, almost impassable with weeds and saplings, led towards a dark mass of stone on a low hill. It was her home, Blackwood Manor. The house was worse than she could have imagined, and yet more beautiful. It was built of a dark, local granite that was almost black when wet, stained with patches of brilliant green and orange lichen. A significant portion of the slate roof on the west wing had collapsed, leaving gaping holes open to the sky. Most of the windows were boarded over. The few that remained were shattered, like vacant eyes. A great stone balustrade along the terrace had crumbled, and a massive drapery of ivy covered almost the entire north face, its thick tendrils pushing into the mortar and dislodging stones. It did not look like a house. It looked like a geological feature, something the land was slowly reclaiming. Jane found a small side door near what must have been the kitchens. The wood was rotten, and with a firm push of her shoulder, the lock gave way with a groan of splintering timber. She stepped inside. The air was cold and thick, with the smell of damp, decay, and sleeping centuries. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light piercing the gloom. She was in a stone-flagged scullery. Pans and pots coated in rust and grime were still stacked by a great stone sink. Moving further in, she entered a vast kitchen with a hearth large enough for a man to stand in, now filled with fallen bricks and birds' nests. She walked through the ground floor in a daze. A dining hall with dark paneled walls slick with damp. A library where the shelves had collapsed, spilling their ruined, mold-eaten contents across the floor like a tide of brown leaves. A grand staircase rose from a central hall. its oak banister miraculously intact, though coated in a thick layer of dust. Everything was broken. Everything was spoiled. It was a task not for a single person, but for an army of workmen with a mountain of money. And she had nothing. She felt the first tremor of true despair. What had she done? This wasn't a home, it was a tomb. But then, as she stood in the ruin of the library, she saw through a grimy window a patch of the view. The house was sited perfectly, looking out over a long, wooded valley. The bones of the place were good. The stone walls were 3 feet thick. It had stood for 300 years. It had not given up yet. Her practical nature, the one Mrs. Gable had so carefully nurtured, took over. She could not fix the roof or the windows, not yet, but she could make one small corner habitable. She returned to the warren of service rooms and found a small chamber off the scullery, likely a pantry or a footman's room. It was tiny, with a stone floor and a small high window that was grimy but intact. Crucially, the roof above it seemed sound. It was dry. This would be her fortress. She retrieved her trunk from the lane and dragged it inside. She spent the rest of the day working. She swept the floor with a bundle of twigs, scrubbed the stone with water from a well she found in the courtyard, and used old sacking she found in a stable to block the drafts under the door. As dusk fell, she lit a single candle. In its small, flickering light, the tiny room seemed almost cozy. She ate the last of her bread, wrapped herself in her cloak and the spare blanket from her trunk, and lay down on the floor. Outside, the wind howled around the ruins of Blackwood Manor, but inside her small stone box, Jane Ashworth slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, the new mistress of a fallen kingdom. Her first priority was survival. The few shillings and pence left in her purse would not last long. She needed food, and she needed a way to keep warm. The woods on her new estate were vast and unmanaged, a tangle of ancient oak, ash, and beech. She spent her days gathering fallen branches, dragging them back to the house, and stacking them in a dry corner of the kitchen. With a flint and steel from her sewing kit and a bit of dry tinder, she managed to start a small, smoky fire in the great kitchen hearth after clearing a channel through the rubble in the chimney. The warmth was a creature comfort, so profound it almost made her weep. For food, she foraged. Her father's lessons, long dormant, came back to her. She found wild garlic in the damp woods, nettles for soup, and late-season blackberries in the brambles. It was a meager existence, but it was enough. Her hands, once soft and nimble from needlework, became rough and calloused. A new strength grew in her arms and back from hauling wood and water. As the days shortened into autumn, she knew foraging would not sustain her through the winter. She needed to plant a garden. Behind the house, choked with a jungle of brambles and thorny vines so thick it was almost impenetrable, was a large rectangular space enclosed by high stone walls. A walled garden. It had once been the productive heart of the estate, but now it was a wilderness. For weeks, Jane attacked it with a rusty billhook she had found. The work was brutal. The thorns tore at her clothes and skin, but slowly, painstakingly, she cleared a small patch near the gate. As she worked, she began to notice the ghost of the garden's former layout, the faint lines of paths, the remnants of espaliered fruit trees crucified against the walls, a crumbling stone fountain at its center, choked with weeds. One afternoon, while trying to dig out the stubborn roots of a massive bramble bush near the center of the garden, her shovel struck something hard. Not a stone, for it gave a dull metallic thud. Curious, she cleared the soil away. She uncovered a large, flat flagstone that did not match the rougher paving of the old paths. It was smoother, squarer, and seemed deliberately placed. A patch of moss grew in a finely carved letter in one corner. Ashworth. A jolt went through her. Using the shovel as a lever, she strained against the stone. It was immensely heavy, but it shifted. With a final, desperate heave, it tilted upwards, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. The space was lined with stone, and lying within it was a heavy iron-bound box, about 2 feet long and a foot wide. It was damp and coated in earth, the iron straps thick with rust. Adrenaline surged through her. She managed to haul the strong box out of the hole. The lock was a solid mass of corrosion. It would never open with a key. She ran to the stables and returned with a heavy iron pry bar she had seen. Lying in a corner, she wedged its tip into the seam between the lid and the box and threw all her weight against it. The rusted metal groaned, resisted, and then with a screech that echoed in the quiet garden, the hinges tore free. She lifted the heavy lid. The scent of damp leather and old, dry paper rose to meet her. Inside, nestled in what was once fine linen, were dozens of canvas bags tied at the neck with string. She opened one. It was full of gold sovereigns, gleaming dully in the weak afternoon light. She opened another and another. There were hundreds of them, a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. Beneath the bags of coin was a velvet pouch. Inside, a pearl necklace of breathtaking quality, the nacre glowing with a soft, milky light. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a thick sheet of oilskin, was a bundle of documents and a single, sealed letter. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The letter was written in a fine, spidery hand, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. It was dated October 1805. It began, "To whomever of my blood finds this, I pray God has been merciful to you. My name is Eleanor Ashworth. This was my home. My husband Thomas built this garden for me. He was a good man, but a trusting one. Our neighbor Geoffrey Thorne, the grandfather of the current squire, coveted our land. Through forged papers and bribed witnesses, he laid claim to the northern pastures and the woods beyond the stream, lands that were the heart of this estate. He ruined us. We fought him in the courts, but he had the deeper purse and the longer reach. The fight left us destitute. We could not bear to see him possess what was rightfully ours. So before we left this place forever, we gathered what we had left and buried it here under my initial, in the hope that one day an Ashworth might return. The gold is for your security. The pearls were my mother's. The documents in the oilskin are the true deeds to all of Blackwood's original lands, along with my husband's sworn testimony of Thorne's fraud. May they give you the justice we were denied. May you make this place live again. Your kinswoman, Eleanor Ashworth." Jane sank to her knees on the cold earth, the letter in her hand, the gold at her feet. Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down her face. She was not alone. She was not the first. 50 years ago, a woman she had never known had left her a map, a fortune, and a purpose. Jane did not act rashly. The letter from her long-dead kinswoman was a call to arms, but the quiet pragmatism Mrs. Gable had instilled in her was a steadying hand. Confronting Squire Thorne directly would be foolish. He was a powerful man, a magistrate, and he would crush her with contempt if she simply appeared with a 50-year-old story. Eleanor's letter had warned her of that. First, she needed to secure her position. She needed to transform herself from a vagrant girl in a ruin to the proper mistress of Blackwood Manor. The gold sovereigns gave her the means. The very next morning she walked into Oakshott. Her clothes were still worn, but she walked with a new, quiet purpose that made people look at her differently. Her first stop was the blacksmith's forge. Mr. Hobbs, a burly man with kind eyes, was hammering a horseshoe. He stopped and wiped his brow as she entered. "Miss," he said with a note of surprise, "I need the gates at Blackwood repaired and rehung." Jane said, her voice clear and steady, "And I need new locks and hinges for the main doors of the house." He looked at her, then glanced in the direction of the manor. "That's a big job, miss. Cost a fair bit." Jane reached into the small but heavy bag she now carried and placed 2 gold sovereigns on his anvil. The blacksmith's eyes widened. A sovereign was more than a week's wages for a man like him. He picked one up, tested its weight in his calloused palm. "I can start tomorrow," he said, his tone now one of deep respect. Her next visit was to a young carpenter she had seen working on a cottage roof. a man named Thomas Green. She found him in his workshop, the air sweet with the smell of sawdust. She commissioned him to repair the roof over the entire east wing, the kitchens, the scullery, and the servants' quarters, and to unboard and reglaze all its windows. She paid him a generous advance in gold. Word of Jane's sudden, inexplicable wealth spread through the village like wildfire. It was a mystery, but the solid, undeniable presence of gold quieted most speculation. She was no longer an object of pity, but of curiosity and respect. She was a woman who paid her debts promptly and in good coin. Mr. Hobbs and his sons arrived with a cart and tackle, and the sound of hammer on iron rang out from the gates of Blackwood for the first time in a generation. Thomas Green and his apprentice appeared, their ladders and tools clattering, and soon the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the roofer's hammer could be heard from the house on the hill. Jane hired 2 village women, the widows May and Alice, to help her clean. Together they began the titanic task of reclaiming the house from decades of dirt and decay. They scrubbed floors, washed walls, and polished woodwork that had not seen beeswax in half a century. The east wing slowly came back to life. A fire burned brightly and cleanly in the kitchen hearth. The windows, no longer blind with boards, let in the pale autumn light. One afternoon, as Jane was directing the placement of a new iron range in the kitchen, a visitor arrived. It was Mrs. Albright, the vicar's wife, a gentle, thoughtful woman. She carried a basket. "We saw the smoke from your chimneys, my dear," she said, her smile warm. "I thought you might appreciate a fresh loaf and some cheese." It was the first act of unsolicited kindness Jane had received since leaving Mrs. Gable. It was an offering not of charity but of welcome. The community was not just watching anymore, it was beginning to reach out. The work on Blackwood Manor became the rhythm of Jane's life and the life of the village. As the east wing became habitable, she moved her few possessions from the tiny pantry into a proper bedroom, with a repaired window that looked out over the walled garden. The gold from the strongbox was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a tool to be used. She hired a team of laborers, led by a steady man named George, to begin the great work of clearing the land. They scythed the overgrown pastures, repaired the miles of dry stone walls that had crumbled, and dredged the stream that had silted up. Jane was a constant presence, not as a distant lady of the manor, but as a working supervisor. She learned the names of the men, their wives, and their children. She ensured they had a hot meal and ale at midday, which she and the widows cooked in the now bustling kitchen. Her fairness and her quiet, unwavering competence earned her a loyalty far stronger than any that Squire Thorne, with all his power, could command from his tenants. Her largest project remained the walled garden. With the brambles cleared, she hired an old gardener from Tavistock, a man named Mr. Finch, who had worked in the great houses. He surveyed the ruin of the garden with a professional eye. "The bones are good, miss," he declared. "The soil is sour, but we can sweeten it with lime. These old fruit trees, some can be saved with a hard pruning." Under his guidance, a new order began to emerge from the chaos. They dug over the great rectangular beds, enriching the soil with cartloads of manure from the local farms. They planted rows of winter vegetables, leeks, cabbages, kale. They repaired the crumbling brick of the cold frames and reglazed their lights. The garden was becoming a place of production again, a living larder for the growing household. Meanwhile, she did not forget the oilskin packet. On the advice of the vicar, a man who disliked the squire's arrogance, Jane sent not for the local solicitor, who was surely in Thorne's pocket, but for a respected lawyer from Exeter. Mr. Davies arrived one day in a smart carriage. He was a sharp, intelligent man who listened to Jane's story in the newly restored parlor, his face impassive. He examined the deeds and Eleanor Ashworth's testimony with meticulous care. He spent hours comparing them to the parish maps and records held at the church. "The claim is exceptionally strong, Miss Ashworth," he finally announced, his voice clipped and precise. The original survey marks described in this deed are still visible on the land, if one knows where to look. The fraud was audacious, but poorly concealed by modern standards. Squire Thorne's title to the northern pastures is built on sand. The legal process began, but quietly. Mr. Davies filed the initial claims, not at the local magistrate's court, where Thorne presided, but at the county seat in Exeter. The squire was served a notice, a cold legal document that informed him his right to a significant portion of his land was being formally challenged. The news sent a shockwave through the district. Thorne was incandescent with rage, but the law, once set in motion, was a machine he could not simply halt with bluster. He was forced to hire his own expensive lawyers from London. The battle for Blackwood's legacy had begun, not with a confrontation in a lane, but with the quiet scratching of pens in distant offices. Back at the manor, Jane's focus remained on the land. People began to call her Miss Ashworth of Blackwood, the name spoken with a new weight. She was no longer a curiosity, but a fixture, a force of restoration. The manor on the hill, once a symbol of decay, was becoming a symbol of hope. Months turned into a year. The legal battleground on a slow, expensive war of attrition that Squire Thorne had expected to win easily but found himself mired in. Mr. Davies's case was methodical and unassailable. The old deeds, the sworn testimony, and the physical evidence of the original boundary markers formed a chain of proof that Thorne's lawyers could not break. In the end, the court found in Jane's favor. It was a complete victory. The judgment restored the northern pastures and the woodlands, nearly a third of Thorne's estate, to Blackwood Manor. Furthermore, he was ordered to pay significant reparations for the 50 years of lost income from the stolen land. The sum was staggering. It cemented Jane's fortune and broke the squire's power in the region. He was diminished, a man hollowed out by his own family's greed. Jane used the money not for finery or travel, but to continue the work she had started. She funded the full restoration of the manor's central block and west wing, employing a score of local craftsmen. The sound of work became the constant, happy music of the estate. With the vicar's help, she used a portion of the funds to establish a small school for the village children in a disused tithe barn, hiring a proper teacher from Exeter. It was an act that sealed the community's devotion to her. She had taken the fruits of justice and given them back to the people. The story now ends where it began, in the walled garden 2 years after Jane first set foot in it. It is a late afternoon in early summer. The garden is no longer a wilderness, but a paradise of order and abundance. Rows of vegetables are lush and green. Roses reclaimed from ancient, thorny stalk climb the warm brick walls, their scent heavy in the air. The espaliered apple and pear trees, pruned back to health, are covered in young fruit. Bees hum in the lavender hedges. Jane, now 20 years old, stands on the central path. She is no longer the gaunt, desperate girl who arrived in Oakshott. The physical labor has made her strong, and the security of her home has given her a quiet confidence that radiates from her. She is not beautiful in the conventional sense, but her face has a deep, settled calm. In her right hand, she holds the small wooden wren her father carved for her so long ago, its wood worn smooth by her touch. In her left, she holds a single, perfect pearl, taken from the necklace Eleanor Ashworth had left in the strongbox. She walks to the stone wall at the far end of the garden, the one that catches the last of the evening sun. There, in a small niche in the stone, she places the wooden bird. Beside it, she sets the pearl. One was a gift of love from a father she had lost. The other, a gift of hope from a kinswoman she had never known. Together, they were the twin anchors of her life. She looks back at the house. Blackwood Manor stands proud and whole against the darkening sky, lights glowing warmly in its many windows. It is not just a house. It is a living thing, breathing again. She thinks of her uncle's cold dismissal of the £3 that were meant to be the end of her story. She was 18 and penniless. She had £3 to her name, and she spent it on a ruin in Devon. It was, she thought with a slow, certain smile, the best £3 she had ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story. We hope it brought a little peace and inspiration to your day. What is something in your own life that others saw as worthless, but you knew had a hidden value? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories of resilience and quiet triumph, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales like this one.